Al Jazeera Podcasts.
Today, Canadians head to the polls under the shadow of Donald Trump.
I think what's really driving you to the polls is this notion of what a Trump 2.0 presidency could look like for Canada.
How the next prime minister could define Canada's relationship with the United States. I'm Natasha Del Toro, and this is The Take.
I'm Supriya Dwivedi. I'm based in Oakville, Ontario, and up until very recently, I was senior advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. I am currently fun-employed.
Fun-employed. That's the best way to be unemployed, as long as it doesn't last for too long. And you were a senior advisor to your former boss was former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. So you had a front row seat to everything that happened with his term, and now I'm sure you have some interesting opinions about this election. Now, this election was called only a month ago, the snap election. I want to start a little bit earlier than that because there is a backstory that's pretty dramatic that you would know all about. Let's go back to December when Trudeau's polling numbers were, I have no other way to say it, but abysmal.
You can say,
yeah, they were bad.
Seemingly the only question being asked in Ottawa, will Justin Trudeau resign or be forced out?
And, look, this is a guy who at some point he was really popular. He was this obviously very handsome man, very smart. He was this fresh face of global, of progressive politics. So, Supriya, tell me, what happened? I mean, why did Trudeau have to step down?
So, there's a few reasons. And if we can just rewind to the lead up to December, I would say that there were internal kind of Liberal caucus rumblings that were happening for about 6 months prior to what had happened in December, which was his finance minister and deputy prime minister had resigned in a very dramatic fashion, giving, the prime minister only about a 30-minute heads up before her statement went live.
Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland has announced she has resigned. Now, in a letter posted to X addressed to the Prime Minister, Freeland says the Prime Minister and her have found themselves at odds over the past few weeks about the best path forward for Canada.
And it became somewhat untenable, I think, for him to have stayed on. And, in fairness to him, in the lead up to this, there were talks internally involving him about what would a potential exit for him look like prior to the election?
Right. So there were definitely some internal battles going on behind the scenes. And so, Supriya, what led to a drop in his popularity, if you had to sort of summarize the public sentiment?
So I think there are a few aspects to it. One, there was a ton of capital D disinformation that was thrown his way, both by, state actors and non-state actors that, we don't necessarily have to get into. But domestically, I would say, in terms of how that played out, is that he was basically blamed for anything that was going poorly in the country at the time. So whether or not it was squarely within provincial jurisdiction, like things like healthcare and university education, for example, he would get blamed for, or whether it was stuff that, is ultimately out of the control of the federal government, which is like grocery stores setting their pricing and pricing going up for groceries because of a host of issues that are happening globally that are affecting supply chains all over the planet. He was just the perfect punching bag and holding place for what folks were mad at. And opposition leader Pierre Poilievre was very, very good at being able to capitalize on that sentiment and to further that sentiment as much as possible with his very savvy online presence, but as well as how he was hammering Trudeau in question period in the House of Commons.
The only plan he has is a Zoom call. No plan to reverse his disastrous liberalization of drugs that have killed people and now threaten our borders. No plan to fix the broken borders that he caused. No plan to cancel the tax increases that will drive billions and many jobs away. Where's the plan to put Canada first?
But you also just have the natural fatigue of anyone who is going to be in the public eye in a political sense for about a decade. And I think after the pandemic and then in the aftermath of the Freedom Convoy that happened in the early months of 2022.
It started as a protest against vaccine requirements for lorry drivers, but it's mushroomed to an anti-government movement, which has paralysed not only this capital city, but vital trade routes between Canada and the US.
There was just a lot of public sentiment of, my former boss being too divisive and perhaps not the guy that was best suited to lead the country in a time where we needed to be united. But then, of course, Trump won the election and it completely changed the sort of calculus of Canadians.
It sure did change the calculus for Canadians. And people ultimately, they get fickle. People want change at some point, right? So the era of Trudeau is over, and now Canada needs someone new to deal with some of the challenges. So let's step back just a little bit and get to the candidates in one more moment. But before we even start, I want to let's take a vibe check here. There were a record number of people who voted in the advanced polls last week, which shows that people are really, really engaged and they are concerned and they care about the outcome in this election.
Millions of Canadians have already locked in their votes. Elections Canada says a record 7.3 million people voted in those advanced polls over the 4-day-long weekend.
What is on Canadians' minds at the moment? Like, what do you think is driving them to the polls?
So I think there's actually a really interesting generational bit of a divide here, insofar as if you're 40, 45 and older, I think what's really driving you to the polls is this notion of what a Trump 2.0 presidency could look like for Canada. He's made open threats about, annexation of Canada, calling us the 51st state.
I think Canada is going to be a very serious contender to be our 51st state.
You don't want to be a part of America? Is that what you're trying to say?
Oh, absolutely not. Not in any way, shape, or form. And so with that comes also this sort of looming economic uncertainty with tariffs. And so we've got this big question mark, I think, for a lot of folks about what the future of Canada looks like in economic terms. And that's driving a huge chunk of the electorate. The 40 and under crowd, though, or even 35 and under crowd, I would say is primarily being driven to the polls by the day-to-day unaffordability of Canadian life, particularly in our metro and our suburban areas in Canada. If you're in the Greater Toronto area, for example, even if you're out in the suburbs, a single detached house is going to run you well over $1 million. And even if you're not looking at buying a house, rents are quite high as well. And I think countries all over the world are seeing this, but the increase in cost to things like, your groceries. And so I think the day-to-day unaffordability of life is what's driving the younger crowd, and the economic uncertainty of what the future may hold under Trump is what's driving the older crowd.
More with Supriya after the break. Before we continue today's show, I wanted to talk to you about Hindsight, a dramatized history show from Al Jazeera podcast. We have a season 7 beginning on Wednesday, May 7th. But in the meantime, you can catch up with season 6 right here on the Al Jazeera YouTube podcast tab, and listen to all the other seasons wherever you get your podcasts. Here's a preview of season 7.
I want to sing, Hassan. That's all I want.
Hindsight, a dramatized history podcast from Al Jazeera.
Have you seen what the British have done? They have stabbed us in the back.
I'm your narrator, Charles Dance. In season 7, we meet people from the Arab world, including dynastic leaders.
I was in my early 20s and running Egypt.
Under my rule, Muslims will retake our lands from foreign invaders.
And artists, like the famed French-Algerian writer Albert Camus.
There is something deeply absurd about the search for meaning.
At that moment, I was no longer Amal al-Atrash. I became Asmahan.
Egypt's sisters in crime.
We were mere spectators who provided food and drinks.
We're not kidding.
You've heard of them.
My name is pronounced Salah ad-Din.
I am Shagarat ad-Dur, Sultana of Egypt.
Now it's time to hear from them.
You may call me Faisal.
My name is Raya Ali Hammam.
I am Skin Ali Hammam.
Hindsight, a dramatized history podcast from Al Jazeera. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Let's talk about who the front runners are here that are now vying to take the mantle of leadership in Canada. Let's start with Mark Carney. After Trudeau stepped down as the Liberal Party leader, there was a leadership contest, and this guy, who's never led public office, won 85% of the vote.
Mark Carney with 131,674 votes.
And now he's in the lead in national polls, much to the dismay of his challenger, Pierre Poilievre. Why has Carney won so many people in Canada over?
I would just add, not only did he win 85% of the vote, he actually won every single riding.
Right, and a riding is an election district, right? That's what you call it.
Exactly. So it's very impressive. Like, his win was very commanding. To answer your question, I mean, I think it's because Carney was almost seemingly engineered in a lab for this moment as a former central banker who has not only guided Canada through the financial crisis of 2008, but he was there to guide Britain through Brexit as well. So two very uncertain economic times for two large G7 countries. And here he is at the helm managing both of those two crises. And I think for a lot of folks, in this moment where economic uncertainty is the main sort of driver for a very large chunk of the electorate, Mark Carney is the guy with the background, the experience, and the temperament to guide Canadians through this moment.
Mr. Carney is the new hope, right? Certainly he comes with an established track record. Leader of the Bank of Canada, leader of the Bank of England, has led, in really tough economic times.
So it's really sort of his role as a central banker that is giving people assurance. What does this also mean, though, for people in the progressive side of things? Carney is not Trudeau when it comes to social issues.
Yeah, he's not. And quite frankly, I think the direction that him and the folks around him have taken the party is very much back to the Liberal Party of our fathers in terms of tone, style, temperament, policy, and the like. So for folks that are actually quite left of center, whether within the Liberal tent or in the New Democratic Party, which is the other more leftist progressive party compared to the Liberals in Canada, quite frankly, the assurances of the fact that Carney won't actively derail a lot of the social progress and a lot of the social policies that have been made under the Trudeau government is one that's they're kind of holding on to, as well as the fact that, a Pierre Poilievre government for a lot of leftist folks is quite scary. And I think is something that for a lot of people, even if Carney is perhaps a little bit too centrist for your taste, you're willing to suck it up in an election where you've got somebody in the White House who's threatening annexation.
Right. It's funny, when I started researching these candidates and getting prepared for this story, I was, learning about him. And I thought he seems a little, again, Trudeau was so charming. He was so charismatic. This guy seemed maybe a little drier. Obviously, like he fit the stereotype of like the central banker. But as I started to listen to him, he's actually he's pretty witty. Like he has funny. Some of his own. Yeah, he's funny. Yeah. Actually, I saw him on Jon Stewart talking, and he could hold his own with Jon Stewart.
What are they making up there of the overtures and sort of trolling to Canada about being a part of the United States?
Well, the bottom line is not going to happen. That
the overture.
Because
you don't want.
Well,
to be with.
We're. We're proud. We find you very attractive, but we're not moving in with you. It's not you. It's us.
And I guess and people see him as very competent, as this sort of steady hand. But I've also seen him described as someone who wants to project this image of being the smartest person in the room that maybe doesn't sit well with everybody.
Yeah, I'd say that. And I think it really tends to come out when he's pressed by the political press here in Canada. And I think that's likely to do with his political inexperience. So when he gets into a bit of that back and forth with journalists in particular, I think is where that snippiness tends to come out.
Now, with Canadians not being aware of what potential conflicts of interest you sought to avoid.
What possible conflict would you have, Stephanie? Stephanie, I'm complying with the rules. I'm complying with the rules in advance. Point final.
Are you saying you are not open to any conflict of interest?
Yes.
Trump spent most of his life in the private sector. There's no possible conflict of interest in your assets. That's very difficult to believe.
Look inside yourself, Rosemary. I mean, you start from a prior of conflict and ill will.
And I think in any other normal election, that sort of thing would have been seen as a if not a major flaw, at least a flaw in him as a candidate, and you would have seen some sort of repercussion from that in terms of like polling.
Right. He's not making friends with reporters. So let's talk now about Carney's his main opponent in this election, who you've mentioned, Pierre Poilievre. He's a conservative leader. And before Trump came into office again, it looked like Poilievre was going to cruise into office until Trudeau resigned, right? What do we need to understand about him, and why has he lost so much support in these last few months?
I think because fundamentally the ballot question changed. So up until, my previous boss resigning, the ballot question was very much going to be, who is best placed to deal with some of the domestic issues, like the unaffordability in terms of housing. And these were the issues that he was sort of hammering. And then, Trump gets elected, he has his inauguration, he makes these comments about annexation. And it's as though Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives did not get the memo that Justin Trudeau had resigned, because he kept hammering the Liberals on Trudeau policy. And it was like, dude, the guy's not running anymore, right? So it was just this very odd and, to be frank, somewhat surreal that they were unable, the Conservatives that is, to shift gears at all. It's like they only had one gear, and it was anti-Trudeau. And once Trudeau was gone, they didn't know what to do with themselves.
They didn't know how to pivot. And some people have even compared him to Trump, right?
So here's what I will say in defense of Pierre Poilievre. I don't think anybody is totally like Trump, right? Like, Trump is Trump, and that's it. Like, he's one of a kind. In terms of where I think the similarities do lie, and I think this is with the broader conservative movement generally in Canada, is that it's shifted to really hammering in on like culture war stuff.
The U.S. government only recognizing two genders, male, female, they're unchangeable. If elected as prime minister, is that something that you're going to kind of walk in line with, or what are your feelings on that executive order?
Well, I don't know. Do you have any other genders that you'd like to name?
So like Pierre Poilievre made it, like he didn't have to do this, but he went out of his way to constantly condemn radical gender ideology. He kept hammering home the notion of this, like, if universities don't respect free speech without really defining what that means, that they were going to get federal funding pulled from it. The focus, I think, on some of what he was concentrated on, that's where I think a lot of the similarities sort of lie.
And just in terms of his personality, how do we interpret him? How do you think about him?
He's the kind of guy who looks like he would have been stuffed into a locker in middle school, because he's petulant, he's argumentative, adversarial at all times, and is always sort of looking for a fight. And in some ways, that's good when you're an opposition leader, right? And you're trying to hammer the government on issues of the day. But when you're trying to look statesman and when you're trying to look like you can actually lead a country and can unite a country, the sort of combative attack dog routine of, I drink liberal tears for breakfast, screw your feelings sort of thing kind of runs short.
In many ways, what you're seeing in this election feels like it could be a case study for other countries that are dependent on the U.S. on how to deal with this Trump White House, which is volatile, aggressive, threatening. Are there lessons that can be learned from how this election is playing out?
So, yes, I think broadly I will say that if you are a right-wing politician and your language, your rhetoric, your behavior, comportment, whatever, mirrors Trump, you will tend to pay a price for that from normal, regular, run-of-the-mill voters who aren't, adherents to your base. There's shades of this in Australia as well, right? Like the Conservative leader has seen their fortunes kind of take a bit of a dip in the aftermath of Trump. But what I would say is that Canada is a bit unique in this case, just because we are so integrated with the U.S., economically, culturally, whatever the case may be, like all of it, right? And we're neighbors. And Canadians tend to have this like very polite sort of reputation. And that's sure, neither here nor there. But what I will say is that our prime defining, ethos as a country is almost that we're not American. And so the notion of like us giving up our sovereignty and becoming a 51st state is just so abhorrent to so many of us on a visceral level that I don't know if the Trump effect would have that same impact in other countries in the same way that it would here necessarily.
Yeah. I mean, and this is really, I guess, something that we need to underscore is that this election is happening at a historic moment for Canada. It's been an unprecedented fallout with the U.S., which is a longtime ally. This fight that Trump picked seemingly came out of nowhere. And whoever the next leader is really going to define what this new relationship with the United States looks like.
Yeah, that's absolutely correct.
Supriya, I've really enjoyed this interview. I want to know just kind of parting thoughts from you as someone who, as we said, you were on the inside of the Trudeau campaign. And now a new leader is going to take over at this pivotal moment. Any kind of parting thoughts that you want to leave us with?
So my one parting thought, I think will be interesting to see how the results actually shake out, is that right now, polling tends to favor the Liberals. But one thing I think that polling may not be capturing is the support of younger millennial and Gen Z men who are quite motivated to go to the polls and are quite motivated to vote for Pierre Poilievre. And it will be interesting to see if that bears out, or if, the polling is in fact quite correct and it ends up being a liberal, an easy liberal win on the 28th.
Well, we shall see. We will all be watching to see what happens in Canada. Supriya, thank you so much for coming on The Take and breaking this all down for us. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Me too. Thank you for having me.
And that's The Take. If you want to catch more episodes like this, make sure you're following our YouTube playlist. That's where you'll find all of our recent content updated regularly so you never miss an episode. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button so you stay in the loop with all things Al Jazeera English. See you tomorrow.